Before we begin, thank you to everyone who supports this channel through memberships. If these stories bring you comfort, there's a join button below. No pressure at all. Now, let's begin. Hermione Granger did not begin by searching for dark magic. That was the story people preferred. It made everything neat. It gave her a clear turning point, a single wrong step, a moment you could point to and say, there. That's where she fell. But Hermione didn't fall. She noticed. And once she noticed, she could not unsee. It started with the curriculum. With what was taught, and what was skimmed past like a stain on parchment. Certain wars were summarized in polite sentences. Certain leaders were reduced to caricatures. Certain spells were labeled unsafe, without explanation. Hogwarts taught outcomes, not causes, as if knowing the ending could protect you from repeating the beginning. Hermione began to keep a second set of notes, nothing dramatic, nothing illegal. Just questions. Why did magical reform always arrive after a crisis, never before? Why did laws passed, temporarily, survive longer than the fear that created them? Why were some families treated like pillars of the world, while others were treated like guests? The questions multiplied. Hermione did what she always did when faced with a system that didn't add up. She looked for the missing pages. The library became her map. Not just the rows students loved, bright with popular texts and tidy spines, but the older shelves where titles were written in faded ink. She learned which sections were updated every year and which had not been touched in decades. She learned how Hogwarts archived its shame, not hidden, not destroyed, simply placed where no one would bother to read. And then there was the restricted section. It wasn't guarded by chains and curses, not the way rumors liked to pretend. It was guarded by something far more reliable. Permission. A line in the floor. A rule that most people obeyed because it was easier to obey than to think about why it existed. Hermione waited. She waited because Slytherin had taught her that impatience was a confession. She waited until her presence in the library became part of the scenery. Until Madame Pince stopped looking up when Hermione arrived. Until the older students stopped treating her as an anomaly and began treating her as furniture. She watched the library the way she watched people. Quietly. Thoroughly. Madame Pince's routine was precise. She checked the sign-out ledger at the same times each evening. She scolded students for crumbs with theatrical fury, but she grew tired after dinner. Her vigilance softened in the last hour before closing, when she cared more about silence than suspicion. Hermione learned the angle of the desk lamp that made Pince's glasses reflect light, limiting her view. She learned which shelves cast shadows deep enough to hide a book's cover. She learned which students received permission slips from professors and what those slips looked like: thin parchment, a sharp signature, no flourish. When Hermione finally approached the line, it felt less like rebellion and more like inevitability. She stepped over. Nothing exploded. No alarms screamed. The air did not turn cold. The castle did not punish her. That, Hermione realized, was the first lesson. Most boundaries were enforced by fear, not magic. The restricted section smelled older than the rest of the library. Dust and leather and something faintly metallic, like ink dried centuries ago. The shelves were packed tighter, the books heavier. Many were not dark at all, just inconvenient. Texts on containment wards. On mind-affecting enchantments used in courtrooms. On magical epidemics. On panic. Hermione did not choose books with dramatic titles. She chose books that sounded like policy. She pulled down a volume on post-war governance and sat at a table near the back, where the light was dimmer and the quiet thicker. The writing was dense, painfully precise. It described how wizarding societies rebuilt after conflict, how they restored stability, how they managed populations that had learned fear. It was not heroic. It was practical. Hermione turned pages slowly, taking notes not of spells, but of patterns. The author described how emergency powers lingered, how institutions hardened after trauma, how leaders promised reform and then quietly prioritized control. Hermione underlined a sentence, then paused. The margin beside it held a handwritten note in crisp script. Correct, but incomplete. The true obstacle is incentive. She blinked. Most marginalia in schoolbooks was childish. Doodles. Insults. Love notes. This was none of those. This was an argument, clean, sharp, disciplined. Hermione's pulse ticked faster as she tracked the handwriting down the page. It appeared again, and again. Not everywhere. Not carelessly. Only where it mattered. She reached the bottom of the chapter and found a small citation. T. Riddle. Hermione went still. She told herself it could be another riddle. The wizarding world was old, names repeated. But she knew. The handwriting felt like a mind that didn't waste motion. She turned back, reread the notes with a different attention. There was no theatrical cruelty, no obsession with blood. The comments were clinical. Stability is never prioritized until instability threatens those already protected. Reform is resisted because the current system rewards those who oversee it. Public morality is a mask. Institutions prefer continuity over justice. Hermione's throat tightened. She read one line 3 times, because it felt like someone had reached into her private notebook and answered her questions before she'd fully written them. They do not fear evil. They fear change. Hermione shut the book softly, as if loudness could contaminate what she'd found. She sat with her hands resting on the cover, fingertips pressed to cracked leather. The most frightening part was not that Tom Riddle had written in the margins. It was that he sounded like someone doing what she was doing now. Studying the world as it was, not as it claimed to be. Hermione forced herself to continue. She did what she always did when something unsettled her, she verified. She located the original texts Riddle referenced. She compared the author's conclusions to ministry archives, to old decrees, to school governance policies buried in dusty appendices. The patterns aligned too neatly. Riddle's notes didn't read like propaganda. They read like diagnostics. Like someone cataloging a disease no one wanted to name. Hermione's stomach turned, not with disgust, but with recognition. He had begun with clarity. So how had clarity become Voldemort? She found the shift slowly, like a crack spreading through ice. Early notes were analytical, measured. Later notes hardened. Words like incentive became weakness. Continuity became cowardice. There was a moment, halfway through a later volume, where the handwriting grew sharper, angrier, as if patience had run out. They cannot be persuaded. They must be forced. Hermione stared at that line for a long time. A sound made her flinch, the soft scrape of a chair somewhere in the distance. She froze, listening. Madame Pince's footsteps did not approach. The library remained quiet. Hermione exhaled slowly. She didn't feel tempted. She felt warned. This was what happened when you saw the truth and decided the truth gave you permission. Hermione packed her notes with meticulous care. She left no ink stains, no folded corners, no evidence of urgency. She returned the book to its shelf in the exact space it had come from, aligned with its neighbors as if it had never been touched. When she stepped back over the line into the public part of the library, she felt the absurdity of it. How easily people stayed on the safe side of a boundary simply because it was drawn. Hermione walked back to the Slytherin common room with the lake's pressure humming behind the walls. Students were laughing softly, trading secrets, planning futures. The green light cast everyone's faces in the same careful shade. Hermione sat by the window and watched shadows drift beyond the glass. She did not think Voldemort was right. She thought something far more dangerous. Voldemort started with questions I would have asked. And that meant the problem wasn't just him. The problem was that the world had made his questions feel necessary. Hermione folded her notes into her book, closed it, and rested her palm on the cover as if to keep it from opening itself. For the first time since the sorting, she understood what fear really was. Not fear of monsters. Fear of becoming the kind of person who could justify them. Hermione Granger did not tell anyone what she had found. Not Harry. Not Ron. Not even the few Slytherins who had begun to treat her with something like wary respect. The moment she spoke Riddle's name aloud, the discovery would change shape. It would become a scandal, a moral panic, an argument about purity and evil and whether she was going too far. Hermione didn't want to panic. She wanted proof. So she did what she trusted. She tested the writing against the world. It began at Hogwarts, because Hogwarts was convenient. People liked to pretend it was separate from politics, a safe little island of learning. Hermione had already seen that was a lie. Hogwarts was a training ground. It taught students which rules mattered, and which rules were for show. It taught them whose mistakes were forgiven and whose mistakes were punished. Over the next weeks, Hermione started keeping lists. Not dramatic lists. Quiet ones, tucked between ordinary notes. Detentions, name, house, offense, punishment length. Points awarded, for what, to whom, under which professor, at what time of day. Recommendations, whispered, implied, hinted at, who was promising, who was well-connected, who was from a good family. At first, the data felt messy. People were inconsistent. Professors were human. There were exceptions. Then Hermione noticed something unsettling. The exceptions weren't random. The exceptions followed the same names. A Gryffindor could talk back in class and be called bold. A Hufflepuff could do the same and be called disrespectful. A Slytherin with the right surname could be misunderstood, while a Slytherin without one could be labeled trouble before they even spoke. Hermione remembered a line from the margin notes. Institutions resist reform because instability benefits those already insulated from consequence. She didn't want it to be true. She kept collecting. In the library archives, she requested older documents, school charters, disciplinary revisions, minutes from board meetings written in language so stiff it felt designed to repel curiosity. She learned how to read past the polite words. She learned how Hogwarts hid decisions behind phrases like consensus, practicality, and the preservation of tradition. Tradition, Hermione realized, was often a synonym for control. One evening, she copied down a section about student protections after a century-old incident. The protections had been introduced, temporarily. The document showed they had been renewed quietly every decade since, without discussion. No one had challenged it, because challenging it would require admitting the system had never fully corrected itself. Hermione closed the file and stared at her own handwriting. It was neat. Controlled. The same as always. But her thoughts were not. Because Hogwarts was only the beginning. The Ministry of Magic was worse. Hogwarts at least admitted it was old. The Ministry pretended it was modern. Hermione began requesting public records the way she requested books, careful and polite. She learned which requests were ignored, which were delayed, and which were quietly denied without explanation. She learned that bureaucracy did not exist to inform people. It existed to exhaust them. She compared Riddle's observations to ministry structures, committees layered atop committees, responsibilities divided until accountability dissolved. Laws written broadly enough to be weaponized and vaguely enough to be defended. Emergency powers that lingered because removing them would require courage leaders did not have. Her notes began to fill with the same repeated phrases. Discretion, tradition, security, stability. Stability was always the excuse. Hermione began to notice what stability actually meant. It meant the same families stayed in charge. It meant the same people were protected from consequences. It meant change was treated like a threat rather than a necessity. Riddle's name appeared again, this time not in margins but in records. A scholarship request for an exceptionally gifted student. A mention in a list of academic awards. A note about an inquiry into unusual ambition. He had been noticed. He had been watched. And yet nothing had been done to address the world he was reacting to. Because addressing it would have required admitting that the system produced him. Hermione felt something cold settle behind her ribs. This was the part people didn't want to solve. Not Voldemort himself. Not the war. Not the jewels and curses and headlines. The conditions. The slow rot that made people desperate, that rewarded cruelty disguised as strength, that punished disruption more harshly than wrongdoing. Hermione watched it play out in small moments. A Muggle-born Ravenclaw with perfect scores was quietly denied access to an advanced apprenticeship because the fit wasn't right. The student didn't even understand what the words meant. Hermione did. A pureblood with mediocre marks received a private letter of recommendation because someone owed his father a favor. No one called it corruption. They called it networking. Hermione sat through a lecture in which a professor praised Hogwarts for being a meritocracy, and she nearly laughed out loud. Not because it was funny, but because it was obscene. Merit existed. Hermione was proof of that. But the system did not reward merit alone. It rewarded alignment. It rewarded people who didn't threaten the existing structure. Hermione began to understand why blood purity ideology was so attractive. Not because it was true, Hermione could see it wasn't, but because it was a convenient story that protected power. If purebloods were, naturally, superior, then the advantages they inherited were not advantages. They were destiny. And if Muggle-borns rose too quickly, too brilliantly, it was not evidence that the system had been unfair. It was evidence that something had gone wrong. Hermione hated the logic. But she could not deny its usefulness. Riddle had understood that too. His early notes mocked pure-blood obsession as inefficient, sentimental, driven by fear of irrelevance. He saw the purity story for what it was, a tool. A justification. A shield. Hermione found herself pausing over one sentence in her notes, tracing the words with the tip of her quill. Blood is not the cause. Blood is the excuse. She set her quill down. Her mind kept moving. Because if Riddle had been right about the diagnosis, and wrong about the cure, then the most dangerous question was not whether he was evil. The most dangerous question was whether anyone else was willing to admit the diagnosis existed at all. Hermione stared out the library window at the darkening grounds. She could already see how it would go. Leaders would deny until denial became impossible. Then they would react too late. Then they would claim surprise. Then they would rebuild the same structures and call it progress. And in time, another riddle would appear. Maybe not with the same name. Maybe not with the same methods. But with the same hunger to correct what everyone else refused to correct. Hermione's throat tightened. She whispered into the quiet, as if the words might change shape if spoken too loudly. If he was wrong, her voice faltered. Why does everything still look like this? No answer came. But the silence that followed felt like confirmation. The war did not arrive with trumpets. It arrived the way cold arrives in a house with thin windows, quietly, at first, then everywhere. At Hogwarts, it began as absences. A student who did not return after break. An owl that never came back. A professor whose name disappeared from the timetable without explanation. People spoke in softer voices, as if volume itself could attract attention. They called it caution. Hermione learned it was something else. Denial, stretched thin. The castle still looked the same. Candles floated. Staircases shifted. Portraits gossiped. The Great Hall served breakfast as if normalcy could be summoned by routine. Hogwarts was very good at pretending. It had centuries of practice. But the fear underneath the stone grew heavier every week. Students stopped wandering alone after dark. Prefects stopped smiling when they reminded people of curfew. Even laughter changed. It came faster, louder, like people were trying to outpace their own thoughts. Hermione watched it all with a kind of brutal clarity. Fear did not make people noble. It made him efficient. Or it made him cruel. Most often, it made him obedient. The Order of the Phoenix moved like a rumor around the school, half seen and never confirmed. Hermione noticed the way certain professors disappeared from the staff table at irregular intervals. She noticed the way McGonagall's jaw tightened when owls arrived. She noticed the way Dumbledore seemed both calmer and more distant, as if he was standing several moves ahead of everyone else and choosing not to explain. In Gryffindor Tower, bravery was becoming a ritual. Students talked about the war the way they talked about Quidditch, full of dramatic certainty, as if victory was simply a matter of heart. Hermione heard the phrases echoed in corridors: "We'll fight. We'll stand. We'll never give in." It sounded inspiring. It sounded like a plan, if you didn't look closely. Harry was at the center of it, whether he wanted it or not. Hermione saw him pulled into conversations, shown partial truths, asked to carry burdens no one had prepared him to carry. He was praised for surviving situations that should never have been allowed to happen in the first place. People treated his bravery like it was renewable. Hermione recognized the pattern immediately. They were spending him. Not maliciously. Not consciously. But in the same way a system spends resources it assumes will always be available. Heroes were useful. Heroes were symbolic. Heroes made people feel safe. And heroes died. Hermione saw how leadership used morality as a shield. When someone suggested a proactive measure, stricter security, clearer information, real training, it was dismissed as panic. When someone insisted on transparency, they were told they would frighten students. As if students weren't already frightened. As if ignorance was protection instead of vulnerability. One night, Hermione overheard two professors arguing outside a classroom. Their voices were low but sharp, cutting through the corridor's quiet. "We can't keep pretending nothing is happening," one of them said, breath tight. "We can't cause panic," the other replied, exhausted. Hermione wanted to step forward. Wanted to ask a simple question. What did they think panic looked like? Had they not noticed the way students flinched at every unfamiliar sound? The way people avoided windows at night? The way fear had already taken root? But Hermione stayed silent. Slytherin silence had taught her that truth delivered at the wrong time became noise. She returned to her dorm and began planning alone. Not the kind of planning Gryffindor celebrated, righteous and loud, built on hope. Hermione planned the way you planned for a fire. Exits. Routes. Containment. She charted where attacks happened, not by location but by consequence. She mapped the kind of fear Voldemort seemed to prefer, fear that fractured trust, fear that turned neighbor against neighbor, fear that made institutions tighten their grip. She noted the ministry's responses. Always late. Always reactive. Always framed as temporary measures that grew permanent the moment people accepted them. Hermione watched the pattern repeat and felt something inside her harden. Not into hatred. Into precision. When a small incident occurred near Hogsmeade, rumors of masked figures, of a shopkeeper harmed, Hogwarts responded with additional patrols and stricter curfews. The measures reassured parents. The Daily Prophet called it responsible. Hermione saw it for what it was. A tightening. Fear making people accept control. Voldemort's cruelty was obvious. That was why people could condemn it safely. But his strategy was more subtle. He didn't just harm. He shaped environments. He forced the world to respond in predictable ways, then used those responses to tighten his hold. Hermione's stomach turned with reluctant admiration. Efficiency was horrifying when it wore a human face. She tried, once, to speak to Harry. Not in the warmth of old friendship, those moments had become rarer, but in the tone of someone offering a plan. "You need more information than they're giving you," she said quietly in a corridor, when the castle was almost empty. Harry looked at her with tired eyes. "They're trying to protect me." Hermione's jaw tightened. "Protection isn't preparation." He flinched as if she'd struck something tender. "What do you want me to do? Demand answers." "Yes," Hermione said, then stopped herself. No. Demanding was Gryffindor thinking. Loud. Emotional. Predictable. She softened her voice. "I want you to survive." Harry stared at her. For a second, she saw something in his face she hadn't seen since the sorting. Trust. Then footsteps approached and the moment dissolved. He nodded once and moved away. Hermione watched him go, and her fear sharpened. Not fear of Voldemort. Fear of a world that was willing to sacrifice its heroes because it didn't know any other way to function. One evening, Hermione stood alone on the astronomy tower, the wind cutting cold against her cheeks. The grounds below were dark and peaceful in the way a sleeping creature was peaceful, beautiful, and dangerous if startled. The castle's wards shimmered faintly, invisible to most eyes but obvious to hers. They were strong. They were not enough. Hermione pressed her hands against the stone, grounding herself. If Voldemort fell tomorrow, people would cheer. They would mourn. They would rebuild. They would tell themselves the story ended because courage was victorious. And then, when the next threat came, they would do it all again. Because the system had no other method. It produced heroes the way it produced tragedies. Hermione closed her eyes. She understood something then that left her breath thin and cold. The war did not need more bravery. It needed foresight. And foresight, she realized, was not something the world rewarded. It was something the world used, quietly, until it was exhausted.